Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening. This is a little interesting and a little new for us. It's the first time we've done something like this, and in particular we're doing it this way because of the weather. We wanted to still make sure we got an opportunity to get the information that we have been preparing out to our parents and members of the community. As many of you know, Westbard is something that members of our community have been talking about for quite a while. This is really our first opportunity to take a close look at the impact Westbard will have on schools. And with the Infrastructure and Growth Forum that Councilmember Berliner is sponsoring on Saturday, now is an ideal time for us to have this conversation, and so we wanted to make sure that we could still have it. And so before I get started, I do want to just kind of make a couple of notes on this particular forum. There are a lot of graphs in this presentation. Some may resonate with you better than others. I will try not to spend too much time on any one graph. What makes this online forum somewhat convenient is that I think you can choose to pause. I may be incorrect on that, but I think you can choose to pause and restart me at any time. And whether you want to take a closer look at a graph or if you need to go and put your kids to bed. And if not, though, we are recording this and we'll make the recording available, and I know for sure that you can pause that and take a closer look at any graph that you may want to. With that said, I'll just kind of get started. I am Jason Sartori, and I am the president of the Woodacres Elementary School PTA. So the purpose of our discussion today is really to provide parents with the information they need to effectively engage on the Westbard issue and to be effective advocates for our schools, in particular because of the forum that is taking place this Saturday, and I'll explain more about that later. I am going to walk through a lot here. As I mentioned, I've got a lot of graphs. I'm going to cover everything from existing conditions in the county to county policy. I'll include an update on the sector plan and the Westbard sector plan, and talk about the potential impact on our schools. I will note that the way we're going to have a decent number of people I expect participating in this today, and so I'm not turning on other people's mics. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and submit them using the Q&A box at the bottom left of your screen. It's tough for me to go and take a look at those questions as I'm going along. But if I get the opportunity, I'll switch over and take a look at those and see if I can answer any of those as we go along. If not, I'll try to catch them at the end. Or if you include your email address, I can catch up with you afterwards. Those questions go just to me. They don't get broadcast to everyone. Okay. So I'd like to begin by providing a little bit of context, a broader context from a county perspective. When you take into account existing developed land in the county and the land that's preserved in the county, only about 4% of the county's land is available for development. So that means going forward, in general, all new growth in the county will be what's referred to as infill and redevelopment. In particular areas that they've identified, such as areas inside the Beltway, along I-270, the Rockville Pike Corridor, or near transit. Commercial areas such as Westbard, in particular those with aging shopping centers, as we have with the Giant Shopping Center with large surface parking lots, they are going to be targeted for growth and improved measures of sustainability, with the idea being that redevelopment of these could actually improve their impacts on the environment. It also helps to better understand the broader context from an MCPS perspective. As the county grows, so do our schools. When you take so total enrollment this year in the school is over nearly 154,000 students, and that's an increase from last year of more than 2,500 students. That's more than an entire high school. Over the past 6 years, more than 1,200 new students have joined the ranks at MCPS countywide. And that growth is expected to continue with more than 2,600 new students coming next year. When you take a closer look at our growth, it's not just about making sure we have the buildings to teach in. We need to have the resources to accommodate other related changes. So for instance, over the last 6 years, school enrollment has increased 8.5%, but the number of students receiving free and reduced price meals has increased 43.5%. ESOL enrollment has grown by 32%. As you can see here, MCPS, like our county, has grown increasingly diverse over the last few decades. While this and the other points I mentioned on the last slide, they do bring many added benefits, it also presents additional challenges for our schools in allocating already scarce resources. And so this is what, the climate in which we're working when we are advocating for more capacity at our schools or for solutions to enrollment. There are other things that the schools are also focused in on, like I said, competing for scarce resources. Okay, so MCPS functions on two separate budgets. The operating budget funds salaries, benefits, supplies, curriculum materials, buses, and various programs in the schools. And for next year, MCPS is requesting a $93 million increase, and that's just to keep pace with the growing student body, to be able to provide the same services that it has in the past, but for more students. A cut in state aid, or cuts in state aid have already reduced the budget request by over $10 million. And to help prepare for next year's budget and to save money now, MCPS has enacted a hiring and spending freeze. Now, the capital budget is adopted biennially in odd-numbered years, but amended in even-numbered years. So it is a 6-year budget that covers the construction of schools and other infrastructure in the county. So when the budget was last passed last May by the county council, the schools received $214 million less than the Board of Education had requested, and that was largely due to state funds that never materialized. This resulted in many school construction and planning projects being delayed. Fortunately for Woodacres, ours was not, because our funding had already been programmed. The board ended up restoring the budget in its amendment request for this year, but the latest word is that when the county council approves that budget in May, that we'll likely see the same cuts as last year, and projects that thought they were back on track may not end up being back on track at all. But again, at Woodacres, we are all set. So I'm going to jump now to look a little more specifically at the Whitman Cluster and talk about what current conditions are like here. So this is a map of our service area and the service areas of our 5 elementary schools. Now, there's a lot of information here, and I'm not going to go through it all. Like I said, you can take a look at this later or on your own time, but I will point out a few things. The first is that just this year, Burning Tree Elementary School went through a feasibility study, which identified options for potential revitalization, and the school's projected enrollment does not currently support moving forward with an addition or revitalization, but having that feasibility study complete is a good thing. Similarly, Bannockburn had a feasibility study around the same time that Woodacres had its study about 4 years ago. So that's good that that has also been completed already. And those feasibility studies, again, provide options, identify options for potential additions or revitalizations of the schools. I did want to point out, as we talk about elementary schools in Woodacres, for those of you that are not part of the Woodacres community that are joining us tonight, Woodacres is after its new addition here, will not have any more space to grow. These are forest preserved areas. This is our playground. This is a forest preserve area. This is a new access road that will be built. And for those of you who are wondering when our construction will begin, I will let you know that just last week we received word that our final permit was approved, and that permit was for this access road, which just so happens to be the first thing they need to work on. They need to build this road to be able to remove the portables that are located back here, and hopefully we'll start seeing that taking place in the next few weeks as the weather gets a little bit better too. So, but you can see we're out of space. So if we grow beyond our capacity that we're going to be built to, we really have no other option for growing any further. Now, here's some information on our middle school and high school, Pyle and Whitman. And the thing to note here is that both schools, well, Whitman this year has undergone a feasibility study that that identified options for adding 19 new classrooms and other critical space for the school, but the actual planning and construction of an addition is not funded in the capital improvement program or budget yet. And Pyle will undergo a feasibility study beginning later this year. Again, without any guarantee of funding for an addition. So here's a picture from one of the most pressing needs actually at Pyle, which is for gym space. It's something that folks at Woodacres and those that have been at Radnor recently, Bradley Hills and Carter Rock Springs, are quite familiar with. But this photo was taken last week during a normal 6th grade PE class, and they're supposed to be playing volleyball here. I'm not exactly sure what I don't see a volleyball, but I see a lot of people, a lot of students. Okay, so now these are the growth trends going back to the 2002-2003 school year. This shows you how each elementary school has changed in terms of enrollment. You can see that Woodacres has experienced a dip this past year. I would expect that that is going to continue. In fact, if I show you, here are the projections. This is what MCPS, the Division of Long-Range Planning, projects our 5 elementary school enrollments to look like over the course of the next 6 years. Pretty much they level out. Ours levels out at Woodacres. The rest all are showing a slight decline. Many people question these trends, and I think that that's kind of a good thing to question, and I'll get into some of that later. One of the biggest things to note about these projections, though, is that they do not include any potential new students from the redevelopment of Westbard. And I would note that I would expect this to actually happen here, this decline next year, as Woodacres is losing its biggest class ever, its biggest grade ever. Nearly 165th graders are leaving, and next year's kindergarten class will probably only have about 100 students or so. Here are the historical trends in enrollment at Pyle in red and Whitman in blue. You can see Pyle has experienced a very large increase of students, influx of students over the last 5 years or so, 4 years, from just around 1,300 to nearly 1,500. Actually, as of just the other day, I was told that the enrollment at Pyle was 1,498. And so the projections show that there will be a similar increase at Whitman, which kind of makes sense as these people move on to Whitman. And they actually show Pyle leveling off, which again, when I talk to folks at Pyle, they really question that and anticipate a lot more growth occurring in their enrollment. Here's another way to look at these, and again, like I said, some of this stuff might end up being duplicative, but it gives different people different ways of viewing things. So in this case, this is the average grade size across the cluster. So gray is elementary school, orange is middle school Pyle, and blue is Whitman. So this is the average size of each grade. I do know that the freshman class at Whitman this year is just about 500 students. So the one thing I kind of take away from this is that as we move up from elementary to middle school to high school, we see an influx of students, and it could be private school students that choose to join the public school ranks after elementary school or then after middle school. And here are the trends that are expected here. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about school capacity and enrollment and some of those projections. This graph shows all 133 elementary schools in the county and where our 5 elementary schools fall in terms of school capacity. The school capacity is defined as the maximum number of students that can reasonably be accommodated in a facility without significantly hampering delivery of the given educational program. And school capacity is based on the number of teaching stations at a school and the average class size, which obviously varies depending on grades and also the types of programs at the schools. One thing I note here is the lines, the yellow and red lines. Those show what the schools recommend. This is their preferred school size between here. So you see most of the schools fall in between those two lines. This dotted yellow line is the superintendent, or well, previous superintendent's recommendation for an increase in that lower limit of the preferred school size. If this is adopted, it would mean that 3 of our elementary schools actually would have a capacity lower than what the preferred lower limit is. And I just point that out as when we talk about how the schools may ultimately handle growth that comes to Westbard, they oftentimes say the first place they'll look is within the cluster, see if there's a solution. And these 3 schools would likely be the ones that they'd look at first for opportunities for increased capacity. And I would note, though, that Carter Rock Springs just reopened in 2010. I do include in here, and in many of these graphs you'll see that I include notations for some BCC cluster schools. In this case, Westbrook and Somerset, 2 elementary schools in the BCC cluster. And I do that because they are also schools that are impacted by Westbard. So just to give you a sense of where they fall in the mix here too. Now, the difference here, this shows actual enrollment, whereas the previous slide showed capacity, how many students a school is built to accommodate. This shows actual enrollment, and you see Woodacres now jumps towards the front of the pack here in terms of actual enrollment. Another way to look at this, this kind of combines the last 2 graphs to show which schools' enrollment levels are over capacity, and those are the ones over here on the left-hand side, and which schools are under capacity over here on the right-hand side. I'd note that as much as MCPS doesn't like to have schools that are over capacity, it also doesn't want to have schools that are dramatically under capacity. It's clearly not a good use of our tax dollars to build schools that have a large number of empty classrooms. And so that's one thing that they consider when we talk about, well, can't you plan for the growth that's coming to Westbard? Their biggest fear is that they put in schools that end up never being needed. And there are other schools that are in dire need of improvements, and they've just built a whole bunch of capacity that never gets used. So they certainly don't want schools all the way down on this end of this spectrum either. Now, this slide shows the projected over/under capacity. And again, the projected, this is based on MCPS's projections for the year 2020-2021. And you'll note that only 2 of our elementary schools are expected to be over capacity. Now, in the case of Woodacres, this now reflects being under capacity, under the capacity of our new rebuilt school or addition. So when we jump up to the middle school level, there are 38 middle schools in the county, and you'll see that Pyle has the largest school capacity, built capacity of all middle schools in the county currently. And that capacity is above. Only two schools in the county have built capacities that are above the preferred upper limit of middle schools, and that's a limit of 1,200. Pyle is built at 1,289. This is actual enrollment. Pyle currently has the highest current enrollment with 1,479 students at the start of the school year, but as I mentioned, it's even higher now, just under 1,500 students. Pyle is also the middle school that is currently the most over capacity, 190 students over capacity. I would also note that I think I sent this out in one of my emails previously, that if you take a look at it in terms of space, square footage per student, Pyle has the lowest, although it's got the 4th largest school in terms of square footage among all 38 middle schools. It's got the lowest square footage per student. Now this is the 2020-2021 projected over under capacity, and you see that we fall from, previously it was over 190 over, now it's expected in 5 years to only be 154 over. Again, these are based on those projections that many of us question. I will note that Westland here looks insanely over-enrolled, and while the BCC cluster is expected to see a large increase in its enrollment due to all the development occurring in downtown Bethesda, this is slightly deceptive here. The BCC cluster is scheduled to have a new middle school open in Kensington in 2017, and MCPS has yet to decide the boundary for that new school. So for now, all the enrollment in BCC 6th, 7th, and 8th grade is shown at Westland Middle School. The reality is that collectively, the 2 middle schools that will be open in 2020 will both be collectively be well under capacity. Okay, high school, you can see here, Whitman falls in the middle of the pack. One thing to note in this is that the superintendent recommended increases to both the lower and the upper limits of the preferred range of school sizes. We take a look at current enrollment. Again, Whitman is somewhat in the middle of the pack, and as of today, I was told that Whitman's enrollment is $1,899 today. So just slightly under where we were at the start of the school year. Whitman is not currently very over enrolled. However, when you jump out 5-6 years, you see we're suddenly expected to be 264 students over capacity. And what becomes clear is a lot more schools are over capacity at this point too, compared to currently. Okay, so before I go on to this, I'm going to take a quick look. Your screen might blink for a second here. I'm just going to see if there are any questions that I can address at this point. All right. There's a question about whether or not Montgomery County representatives told Woodacre's audience last spring that school growth is projected to decrease in 10 years. I don't have the 10-year projections in front of me right now. I don't believe that's the case. So when they run their projections. They do it for the next 6 years, and then they do 10 or 15 or 20 years out as well. And one thing I'll show you in a little bit is just how unreliable those projections. The further out you go, it kind of makes sense just how much more unreliable those are. And I don't have any more clarity on what those are going to be 10 years down the road. And I'll tell you that I know that they don't include anything coming from Westbard for sure. And let's see. I'm sorry for the pauses here. If we were in all together, someone could be doing a little dance at this moment, but unfortunately, okay, there were some questions about projections. I'll get in a little bit more into that and in just a second here. So now I'm gonna go back to the slideshow here. Okay, so the subdivision staging policy, this is the county's annual test to determine the adequacy of the county's schools to handle growth. It's also referred to by some as the county's growth policy. Essentially, the county planning department will look at each school's projected capacity and enrollment for 5 years out. It says it's 6 years out. By the time they do it, it's really 5 years out. They'll do it this summer. If a school's capacity utilization, now that is the enrollment as a percentage of capacity. So if a school has a capacity of 1,000 and they've got 1,100 students at the school, then its utilization rate is 110%. So if the capacity utilization is less than 105%, then it's considered adequate. If it's between 105 and 120%, then any development that occurs within that cluster will be required, the developer is required to make a school facility payment per unit that they build. The important thing to note with all of these is that it's utilization across an entire level. So it's not individual schools. If Woodacres is currently at 137% capacity, it's not based on that, it's based on all of the elementary schools collectively across the cluster. And what's important, why that's important, is the next step, which is at over 120%, a moratorium is put in place, meaning that no new development can occur within that cluster until there is the capital improvements program shows an increase in capacity through some sort of solution, typically an addition or a new school or whatever it may be. So again, the fact that Woodacres is at 137% capacity currently does not put a moratorium in the Woodacre service area, because collectively the capacity of our elementary schools is around 102% or so. But it's also based not on the current utilization rate, but it's based on the utilization rate for 5 years out. The the fiscal year 2016 school test will be adopted in July. Currently, there are no moratoria in place. However, there are 4 high schools right now, Northwood, Einstein, Gaithersburg, and Wheaton, that all have, for the first time this year, projected utilization rates over 120%. 5 years out. They will all enter into moratoria unless the county council is able to approve something in the capital improvements program that it'll pass in May, showing an increase in capacity in those schools sometime over the next 6 years. So this shows for our cluster what the capacity utilization is projected to be. Again, this is all based on MCPS's Division of Long Range Planning projections. This is what it's expected to be in 2020. Now these lines here mark those thresholds that I mentioned, 100% just to show you which ones are over capacity, but then at 105, everything above this requires payments by the developers. Anything above this requires a moratorium to be put in place. Again, we don't look at the individual schools here. I just offer this to show you. We look at the levels. And so 5 years down the road, in 2020, elementary school is only expected to have 95% utilization across all of our cluster. Again, these numbers still do not include anything from Westbard. And I'll show you later the impact that Westbard will have. Here's how our elementary schools currently fall across all elementary schools in the county. So just to give you a sense of, how bad is it for us in terms of being over capacity, our utilization rate. So we know Woodacres is pretty well over capacity, but it's interesting to note that there are some 15 schools or so here that have capacity utilization rates that are even higher than us. Burning Tree also has a high utilization rate right now. However, when I jump forward to 2020, you see the Burning Tree one has fallen back slightly. Woodacres falls all the way back to here, something around 95% or so. Again, this is based on their projections, and this incorporates the new capacity that we'll have after the addition. Here's middle school. So we talked about how Pyle has the highest capacity, it has the highest enrollment. It also has the highest utilization rate at 115% at the start of this school year. Now this is what's projected for 6 years out for middle schools. This is high schools currently. Whitman's right around 100%, 101%. When we jump out the projection for 2020, Whitman's at 114%. Once again, without including anything from Westbard. All right, so this is where I was talking to you about the further you go out, the higher the error rate goes in their ability to project or to predict what enrollment will be. So when you take a look at Woodacres, these blue dots represent the average over the last 13 years of projections. That 6 year out projection on average is over 20% off. They're much better at projecting what's going to happen 1 year out, but even there, they're on average 5% off. And at Woodacres, they've been as much as 12% off, predicting what the very next year's enrollment is going to be. One other thing to note in these data are that as they move up to the middle school and high school level, and this is consistent, I've done this for several other schools, but as they move up, they do a better job of predicting what the enrollment will be. And that kind of makes sense because they have a better idea of where their students are coming from and how many students are going to be coming from each of the lower levels. At the elementary school level, it's more difficult to predict because they don't know, there's no census of nursery schools in the area. They don't know where you go to nursery school doesn't dictate where you're going to end up going to elementary school. They don't know how many are going to stay at the nursery school for kindergarten. They don't have that data on those younger children. Oh, the other thing I would say about that, just go back to this for 1 second. It's not really evident here, but I will say overall, the Division of Long Range Planning does a really good job of projecting overall growth in MCPS. It's when they get down to the individual schools or cluster levels that it becomes much more difficult for them. But their overall calculations, they do a pretty good job there. And I've made this point numerous times, but that the current projections do not take into account any development, redevelopment in Westbard, including the Equity One owned properties. And so now I'll get into discussion specifically about Westbard. Before I do, let me just take a real quick look at questions again. This is okay. All right, I think I'm set. All right. So I'm going to start by talking about the Westbard sector plan. So for those of you, and I'm just taking a look real quickly at the survey here, those of you that answered the poll, nearly 66% of you, this is the first time you've participated in a conversation, a community meeting of sorts. I don't know if I call this a meeting, I'm sorry, with regard to Westbard. There are a number of players that are involved in this. We have the county's planning department staff, urban planners. They are staff people. Their bosses, if you will, are the planning board, which are appointed by the county council. The county council is also involved. Ultimately, they are the ones that, the council is the one that will adopt the sector plan. MCPS, Division of Long Range Planning, I've mentioned them numerous times already. They are the ones that run the projections. They also plan the addition and revitalization projects. MCPS Board of Education obviously is a player in this. Westbard property owners and local civic associations, and of course you as parents of students who are going to be impacted by the impact on schools here. So to give you a quick timeline of what brought us to where we are today, the last time a sector plan was adopted for Westbard, and a sector plan is basically a comprehensive plan for a small commercial area in the county. I think there are 20 or 30 or so of these plans for the county, and they like to update them every 20 years or so, but ours in Westbard has not been updated since 1982. Jump forward a couple of decades, and in the mid-2000s, Capital Properties was a property owner, owned most of all of the properties that Equity One currently owns, and I'll show you those in a second. But Capital Properties revealed plans to redevelop its Westbard holdings, and those plans weren't publicly revealed. They revealed them to a small group of people who reported that those plans had 15 to 16-story buildings spread throughout the whole neighborhood. It was at that point that the Citizens Coordinating Committee on Friendship Heights, which is an association of local civic associations, commissioned a study. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to fix this. That says AU, but it was Catholic University of America, not AU. Catholic University study called A Vision for River Road, Westbard Area. It in fact is a mini sector plan for Westbard. And it was based on many conversations that study group had with members of the community. Jump ahead 5 years to 2013, and Equity One purchased 22 plus acres from Capital Properties. I will note that Capital Properties plan kind of was foiled by many things, not the least of which was the downturn in the real estate market. But in 2013, they sold their properties to Equity One. Many of their properties. These are the ones that they sold. We have the Manicare property here, Westwood 2, which is where the Pulse and where International School of Music used to be, Domino's Pizza, the Citgo station next to it, Westwood Tower, which is the tall building, it's 14 or so stories here, which is an apartment building, Bowlmore, the bowling alley, and the Citgo station next to that. And then, of course, the big one is the giant shopping center, Westwood 1, and its entire parking lot here. So you can see, kind of to orient yourself, this is River Road and Westbard Avenue here. Sorry, wrong way. Okay, so beginning in the winter of last year, Equity One started holding community meetings to talk about what they'd like to do, what people in the community would like to see there. By spring, the county council had pushed up the sector plan rewrite by 1 year. It was calendared to start in summer of this year, But Equity One was really pushing to have them started earlier, and a lot of the local civic associations were behind that, thinking, while you've got people all fired up and involved, let's continue and get this going sooner rather than later. Plus, it had been well overdue. In July of last year, the planning staff started the sector plan update, and in November, they held a series of meetings called a charrette, basically open sessions with members of the community to come in and take a look and make suggestions about what they'd like to see the Westbard neighborhood look like. So that charrette took place over a week. After the first day, they produced 8 concept plans. These were developed by people who participated in the meetings. They sat down in groups and they identified what they'd like to see located in different places, and they put a bunch of notes associated with that. The planning staff then took those notes and merged them into 3 concepts, or 3 schematic diagrams. And this, I believe, was one of those. Day 3 resulted in 2 concept plans with more details in it, and then after day 4, the planning staff narrowed it down to 1 single concept framework plan. Before I show you that, I just want to note that during this time, Capital Properties came in to the charrette and revealed their plans to build 2 new towers on the only site that they did not sell, that they still hold in Westbard. And I'll show you those in a second, in a little bit here actually. But in December, the planning staff reviewed their preliminary concept framework plan with the planning board, and that is their draft sector plan, which is the basis for a lot of the information that I'll provide you coming up. So here is that concept framework plan. This was what they submitted, what they're still working on, and we'll be making revisions to this over the coming weeks. So the height limits in here range from 50 feet, those are the ones in orange, to 80 feet, the ones in red, 75 feet, the ones in blue. And just to give you a sense of what that means, this is from the planning department, what they showed. This is what 50 feet would look like on River Road. It's essentially 4 stories, 1 story of commercial on the lower level, and then 3 stories of office above it or residential above it. This is what 75 to 80 feet would look like. It would be about 6 stories. Okay, the concept framework plan advocates for a mixture of uses throughout the neighborhood, residential, commercial, office, civic, and industrial. The one thing to note, though, is areas that are currently commercial would be more likely to have a mixture of residential and commercial under the new plan. One of the most interesting parts of this is that they designated land down here where Little Falls Library is currently located as a potential site for a new elementary school. The idea would be that the library would be relocated to the center, what they're referring to as the village center here by the Giant site. This is a questionable move, partly because there's a lot of confusion over school boundaries here, as I'll show you in a little bit. This is Westland Elementary School, squarely in the middle of the Woodacres cluster area, the Whitman cluster area. But I'm not exactly sure elementary school is our issue, and we'll get to that. So, jumping ahead a little bit more, after the planning staff presented this to the planning board, and like I said, they're continuing to work on it. In February, last month, Equity One revealed their plans to redevelop its Westbard properties. And I'll show you those in a second, but just to give you an idea of where things go from here, in March, this planning staff this month will provide additional recommendations to the planning board, and then finally in May they will hand their draft of the sector plan off to the planning board. The planning board then works with the staff over the next few months, and will hold a public hearing in the summer, and by the fall will submit a draft sector plan to the county executive and county council. In the winter, the county council will then hold its public hearings on the plan, and then finally, spring of next year, the sector plan will be adopted by the county council. Once it's adopted, it makes recommendations for height limits and setbacks and types of uses across the cluster. The planning department then needs to create a new zoning map using the zoning code to reflect what is in that sector plan. So it will be by the fall of next year that that sectional map amendment, an amendment to the zoning code, will be adopted. Once that's done, then the developers, the property owners, are free to submit their development applications to the planning department to begin the process of redeveloping their properties. So let's take a look at what Equity One's plan has. First, I just want to point out where the school boundaries are located here. This reddish area, this is the BCC cluster. Blue is the Whitman cluster. As I mentioned, here's Westland Middle School, which serves BCC. One thing you'll note, here are the Equity One owned properties in the yellow hash marks. All of Equity One's properties fall within the Woodacres Pile Whitman service area. So any redevelopment of their properties will add students to the Whitman cluster. So what are they planning to do? I'm not going to go into great detail about this. If you want to, I can show you where their website is, and you can look at more at what they have. But what I kind of want to point out here, this is the giant site. This is Westbard Avenue here, is the amount of residential. You know, a lot of what they plan for that giant site is commercial. But you've got some residential, new residential here, which is near River Road and Ridgefield Road. And this up here is, these are all townhouses. And underneath those townhouses, they have one level of commercial. And then all the parking that is currently here now, that all gets moved below grade. That is all underground parking in their plan. As I mentioned, this is mostly commercial, some office space, but residential up here in these townhouses, apartment condo buildings here, and then this is also residential. This is what is currently Bowlmore. Now, Bowlmore has the longest lease with Equity One, and so this is actually, they've said this would be the last piece that they would develop. They have not yet been clear about how they will stage their project, but I do note that this site over here is the former Manor Care site. Manor Care actually still has a lease on it, but they've abandoned the site. Their lease is up, I think, this month or soon, and it will be unleased at that point. And I also note that Westwood 2, where Pulse is fairly, has very little, its occupancy is fairly low relative to what's here in the giant site. And so I suspect that they're going to want to do these residential pieces first. I think it would be great if we could push them to do the other parts first, which would give MCPS more time to prepare for the potential residential impact that their redevelopment will have. But anyway, this is just another look of what they're proposing, just to give you a sense of the heights compared to, this is the tall Westwood Tower building that currently exists. Okay, Park Bethesda. I mentioned earlier that Capital Properties came in with a proposal for their only remaining site at in Westbard, and that is the Park Bethesda luxury apartment building, which currently has 258 apartments. It's 11 stories. It is a former office building, and it has currently 59 Woodacres students, Woodacres Pile and Whitman students that come from Park Bethesda. In November, the owner of the property, Capital Properties, proposed 2 new buildings on that site. One would be 25 to 30 stories, which would be up to 300 feet tall. It would actually make it the tallest building in Montgomery County. The other was going to be 12 to 14 stories up to 150 feet tall. And alone, according to, I did not see their presentation, but what I've read is that they reported it would add 700 to 1,000 new residential units alone just on this one site. Here was a snapshot that someone took, Robert Dyer took of the one of their plans. This was the one that included the 30-story building here right on Westbard Avenue. And this is the 12 to 14-story building, and this is the existing 11-story building here. So this is also what we need to be aware of, and right now, this is also within our cluster. Okay, I'm going to take a quick look at the questions again. Okay, there was a question back on the projections of where they were off. Are they both high and low? Are they biased in one direction? Are they always low or high? That I don't know off the top of my head. I can check and see where those land, but I did do it so that it was the absolute value of those, so we could just really see how far off they are. On average across the county, they tend to average out to right around 0. They do a pretty good job across the county, but they'll vary. In some cases, they're high off by being high. In some cases, off by being low. There's a question about whether busing students from Westbard to those elementary schools with lower enrollment ratios, if that's been proposed as an option. It's not one that I've heard of. The one thing I would suggest is if you think of some creative solutions that have not been discussed previously, is to certainly think about participating in the forum on Saturday. The afternoon of that forum will be focused on coming up with some of these other solutions, but I have not heard of that one just yet. There was a question about whether or not we're likely to hear about possible movements of kids now expected to go to Pyle instead into Westland once the new middle school opens. I haven't heard of that, and I will tell you that one of the last things that they'll consider is redistricting across clusters, and yeah. It's tough for me to try to read all of these questions. Okay, yeah, there's a good question about whether or not the capital properties, what they've planned is actually something that they can do within the proposed sector plan. And the answer is no, they can't. So the current zoning for their property, I think, allows 45 feet tall. And the proposed zoning under the draft sector plan is only 50 feet tall. So they came in asking to be able to build a 300-foot building, and the current draft only allows 50 feet, which is a good thing, except when I spoke to the planners, I asked them specifically if Capital Properties had been back in to see them to lobby for a higher height limits there. And at the time, this was about a month and a half ago, they had not. There was also the expectation that they would not come back in, that they would probably wait until later in the process when the plan is before the planning board or the county council, and at that point bring in their hard hitters to try to advocate for higher height limits on their property. So the point that made to me is that even, you know, as we advocate for lower densities and preparing, you know, MCPS for whatever impact may come here, the fight isn't over when it gets to the planning board. It's not over until that's adopted over a year from now. And so we'll need to continue to have the conversation with members of the school board and members of the planning board and members of the county council. Okay, so student generation rate comparisons. So these are rates that I received from the planning department that they, I believe, received from MCPS. Okay, so these show the different types of residential units. Single-family homes, not surprisingly, each individual single-family home is more likely to generate a student than more dense type of development. So high-rises generate the fewest students per unit than single-family homes do. The difference being that you have a single-family home on a quarter acre, whereas on a quarter acre you might have 10 townhouses. So it's it makes up for these higher density types of development make up for it in just the fact that they are higher density. So, but this is the number of students generated by type of unit per 100 residential units. So across the county, elementary schools, single-family homes generate, 100 single-family homes will generate about 37 students. They'll generate about 15 middle school students and nearly 20, about 19 high school students. What the county uses to, or what MCPS uses to run its projections for our schools are these Southwest County rates. So they take the county, but then they divide it up into 4 quadrants. We fall in the Southwest quadrant, and these are the rates, the generation rates for the Southwest quadrant in terms of elementary school, middle school, and then here high school. The important thing to note is really on this next slide. This is just taking a look at high-rise rates. The number of students that will be generated. This is the Southwest rates. These are the rates that the MCPS uses to run our projections. They project for every 100 residential units in a high-rise building will only generate 4 elementary school students, less than 2 middle school students, just over 2 high school students, a total of 8 students in 100 apartments in a high-rise K through 12. But that's not really what we see happening in our own neighborhood. When we take a look at Park Bethesda, you can see Park Bethesda generates per 100 units just about 23 students. When we take a look at Westwood Tower, which is the taller building on Westbard Avenue, it generates nearly 31 students per 100 units. And so one of the things that we've been advocating for is that the county needs to look at more localized numbers when they run their projections. Because where we're currently pulling students from, these buildings, they generate more students, 3 to 5 times more students than the rates that they're using to run their projections. So this is kind of the one of the key takeaways. So I'll leave it on this for just a second here. Okay. All right, so now let's take a look at what the sector plan, this concept framework plan, this draft sector plan would allow. Under current zoning, the zoning that exists in Westbard right now, those properties could have up to 1,684 residential units. But what we actually have is just over 1,100 residential units in all of Westbard, the entire sector, not just the Whitman part of it, the entire sector. Under the concept framework plan, that overall capacity of 1,684 would jump up to 2,789. So under the new plan, and again, to their credit, they are still working on it. They have not finalized it. And once they hand it off to the planning board, it won't be finalized. It won't be finalized for over a year. But the capacity would increase to 2,789 under the current draft. So let's take a look at that split between Whitman and BCC. What you see is that in the Whitman portion of Westbard, under the current zoning, we are nearly completely built out, meaning all that is allowed currently is 820 residential units, and we have 713. Under the concept framework plan, that 820 would increase to over 2,000, nearly 2,100. So you could see just how many more residential units could potentially be built. At BCC, we see something different. They are not currently completely built out. Under the draft plan, the capacity, the number of residential units that could be allowed in their portion of Westbard actually decreases. I've been told that the reason for this is primarily the Washington Episcopal School site is currently zoned residential. Under the new plan, that zoning would be changed to institutional, and as a result, it loses residential capacity. But I just see this as a stark comparison here. And it just shows that the brunt of the impact that's going to be felt from Westbard is squarely on the Whitman cluster. Now, one thing that needs to be noted and is important is that very rarely, in fact never, do these sector plans get fully built out. So it's more likely what they see is around 50% of what is planned. On the high end, maybe 75 to 80% of what's planned in a sector plan gets built out. And it doesn't get built out on day one. It gets built out over a 20-year period. And that's the horizon that the sector plan looks at. So if this plan goes forward as is, are we ever likely to see 2,000 units? No, not likely. I mean, as I indicated previously, you could currently see something like 1,600 across the entire sector, and we only have 1,100. You never really see it get fully built out. But just the fact that there's this drastic change in that potential is something that's worth noting, and that the brunt of it is felt by the Whitman cluster is something also worth noting. Okay, so now what impact does it have on our schools? I ran a bunch of calculations to figure out how many additional students in the Whitman cluster Westbard could produce. And I used 4 different sets of generation rates. I used those Southwest County rates, in particular the mid-rise rates, so not the high-rise. Remember, the high-rise had the lowest, mid-rise had the next lowest. The highest generation rates were single-family homes. I used mid-rise rates because that is what the Westbard planners used when they ran their estimates. The second set of rates I used were the Westwood Tower rates. And then I used the Park Bethesda rates. Now, both of those are high-rises. High-rises, according to these rates, are anything above 4 stories. And then I did a combined Westwood Tower and Park Bethesda rates. Again, I think those Westwood Tower and Park Bethesda rates are more consistent with what we would expect to see in our cluster. There are certain assumptions that are included in these projections. The first is the types of units. Again, these are high-rise. We're not going to see all high-rise. We'll see mid-rise. We'll see some condos or or townhouses. So there are some assumptions built into these about the types of units built. There's also a timing and staging of the new development. When some of these graphs I'm going to show you, just plot all of the potential development on top of what is currently projected in 5 years out. Clearly, not all of this is going to be done in 5 years. In fact, it would be Equity One would be really lucky if in 5 years they've got anyone living in their site just yet. But the other is that I've assumed complete build out of the sector plan. So build out every allowable residential unit. And it also assumes that there are no further changes to the sector plan. Like I've indicated previously, it goes to the county council at a certain point. It's possible the county council cuts this down drastically, or they might increase the densities. So here are the calculations, the number of additional students that would be generated by Westbard just in the Whitman cluster. I walked through these, but I think it's probably better just to let you kind of absorb them a little bit. Using the more conservative rates that the planners have used, 208 total students K through 12. But using the higher rates, which seem to be more consistent with what we see in our cluster, we could have potentially up to 419 new students. And again, this is assuming that everything gets completely built out. The important thing to note, though, is that when you look at the sector, which portion of the sector is likely to happen? It's the properties owned by Equity One, the property owned by Capital Properties, that Park Bethesda site. It's pretty much everything in the Whitman cluster. So we're much more likely to see things happening in our portion. And with that Park Bethesda site, I would just note that right now they're only allowed under the draft plan those 5 stories. But we know that they're definitely going to be pushing for more if what they came to the planning staff in November was for 30 stories. So if that goes through and they potentially bump up to even 10 stories, you're going to see this number increase. All of these numbers will increase. So how does this look? Before I show you how this looks, I did also run specifically on the Equity One properties. Now, the thing here, this is not based on Equity One's plan. I don't have all of the numbers for their plan, but what I got from the planning staff was what their draft plan includes for the Equity One properties. Based on what that draft plan includes in terms of the mixture of condos, apartments, and townhouses, this was the potential impact just of the Equity One site. And this assumes it's something around 700 total new units coming to Equity One's properties. So how do these numbers change our projections? Again, this assumes that everything happens within the 5 years, which is not realistic. But our current capacity at Wood Acres, our current enrollment as of today is 724 students. That puts us at 137% of our current capacity, which is based on our existing structure on Cromwell Drive, which is 527 students. This back here reflects our new and improved capacity after our addition. Our current projection for 2020 is that we'll have 705 students, down from where we are currently, and that's 93% of capacity. When you add in the Westbard effect, it ranges from 807 students to 911 students, which puts us between 107 to 120%. When we look at Pyle, the impact here is not as dramatic as I think we would expect it to be. And the problem is that we still feel that those projections that they have, their standard projections right now, are too low, are not accurate. Again, 5 years out, in 2020, they project Pyle to have 1,443 students, which is more than 50 less than where they are today. But starting with this as our base, Westbard would get Pyle to between 115% to 117% capacity, assuming there's no change in what that capacity level is. At Whitman, it's a little bit more drastic. Today, we're just at about 100% capacity. Enrollment as of this morning was 1899. The projected, according to MCPS, is to be at 114% of capacity in 2020. If you add in the Westbard effect, it jumps up to 117 or 122, somewhere in that range. Again, that's assuming that they move forward with what is currently planned. So before I get into the options, and we're coming to the end here, I do want to just real quickly to see. It was a question whether we'll be making this presentation to the county planning board or county council. we've been talking to them a little bit. We definitely want to make this information available to them. We'll be posting this online. Everyone can get the opportunity to listen to me talk about this for over an hour anytime they want. Anyway, but yeah, we definitely plan to continue the conversation not only this Saturday at the forum, but beyond, and having conversations with Council Member Berliner as well as others on the County Council and the Board of Ed, as well as the Planning Board. So typical approach is that this is what we've heard from MCPS as to how they'll handle this. The first thing they'll do is look to identify solutions within the cluster. As I mentioned earlier, I think that there are solutions from an elementary school perspective to the enrollment effects that we're going to see in at Woodacres. That will be their first place that they'll look. Then they'll look to repurpose existing MCPS or county-owned properties, such as Radnor, taking Radnor and returning it back into an elementary school as opposed to a holding facility. I have a slide coming up where I show you all of those potential solutions. And then the last thing that they'll consider is redistricting across clusters. Doing something like taking Westbard and moving it over to the BCC cluster. Now, I will tell you that there's reluctance, obviously, in general, to doing anything about this redistricting. It's kind of the third rail of MCPS or of school planning. No one wants to touch it, and it makes no one's happy when it happens. You know. But just so you're aware, while the BCC cluster might have excess capacity at the elementary school level, and after their middle school is built, they'll have excess capacity at the middle school level. Where they won't have capacity is at the high school level. BCC is scheduled for an addition, and after that addition, they basically have said there's really no more room for them to grow. So this is basically the way MCPS thinks, and what we need are people with some other creative solutions to start talking about those. And I can mention a few, but I think the key thing is participating in this conversation on March 7th, this Saturday, and being able to present some of those ideas there. Okay, so here are some of those other facilities that are located across our cluster. The first is Brookbond Elementary School, which is the Washington Waldorf School on Sangamore Road. It's currently leased to Washington Waldorf for a 30-year lease, although it's actually 6 consecutive 5-year leases, and I believe the county has the option to opt out of that. The Clara Barton Elementary School, there's a preschool there currently. Concord School over here in the Bannockburn service area. That is a small property, just under 3.5 acres, but it does have an adjacent park similar to what Woodacres has currently. It's currently used for I think there are 2 preschools there, and MCPS uses it to store its records. The Fernwood Elementary School, up here, I believe that is where Woods Academy is. And finally, the Radnor Center, which many of us are familiar with now. So other solutions. Again, this is definitely something we want to talk about, and if you want to post them in the Q&A, I'll mention them. But there's been some discussion about maybe thinking about moving 5th graders and 6th graders into a separate school to relieve the burden in elementary schools and in middle schools. There are a few other solutions that are ideas that people are talking about, but certainly be thinking about these. And this is the forum that I've been mentioning, Infrastructure and Growth. Are we keeping pace? It's this Saturday at BCC High School, you know, it's more than just being able to talk about other ideas. One thing we need to make sure is that people are aware of some of the impacts and the issues that exist with current practices and policies. And that's where I've got my final set of slides here are all the key takeaways from all of this. And these will make available, and I'm going to make the whole presentation available on the Woodacres website. But, you know, again, Whitman cluster planning, MCPS needs to plan for Westbard's impact now. They're reluctant to do so. They typically won't start including the Westbard impact until development applications come in, because they don't want to plan for just a vision in a sector plan, again, because they don't want to build capacity where it ultimately isn't needed. And so until those development applications come in and building permits are issued, they do not know for sure that that growth is coming. What we'd like to say is there is some inevitable growth coming to Westbard when you've got developers that are not only talking about wanting to redevelop, they're actually revealing their plans for 30-story buildings. So MCPS is somewhat turning a blind eye if they don't plan for the impact now. The county needs to fund the Whitman and Pyle planning efforts in the next CIP, the Capital Improvements Program, with an agreement that MCPS will agree to include realistic generation rates from Westbard. So again, it's and this is pointed out later, but to talk about using more localized projections, but also the point here is we want to move forward with our planning efforts. Right now, there is no, we've done the feasibility study at Whitman, but there's no money dedicated to actually do the planning, develop the blueprints, and actually build the addition at Whitman. Same thing with Pyle. And Pyle really is the Whitman cluster's bottleneck. Elementary school solutions exist, whether we redistrict within the cluster or we repurpose some of the school's existing buildings. There is a solution there. It's really Pyle that already has the largest capacity, highest enrollment, least amount of space per student, and the highest utilization rate. And really, due to limited land area, the solution is much less evident at the middle school level. MCPS projections. The high-rise residential generation rates in Westbard and the Whitman cluster are 3 to 5 times higher than the rates used by MCPS for their projections. And this really highlights then a disconnect between the planning staff, which they're moving forward with their sector plan, and MCPS, where MCPS's school projections do not consider anything yet happening at Westbard. And one thing I'd point out is if you have participated in Westbard meetings, you often hear people raise the issue of the increased traffic congestion that the increased density will result in. And the response you always hear from the planners is, well, we'll do our transportation analysis, and if that analysis shows that the intersections and roads will be overburdened, then we will either lower the density in our plan or we will revise the street plans to accommodate the higher growth. But when you ask about schools, you don't get a similar response, and that's because the planning staff has no control over what happens to the schools. And so the idea is MCPS really needs to be more integrated in this process so that they can provide that answer accordingly as well. And that's the master planning process. The school planning must be more fully integrated into the sector planning to ensure the sector vision can become a reality. With regard to the subdivision staging policy, averaging across the cluster turns a blind eye to overcrowding within individual school service areas. So last year, when Woodacres was at nearly 800 students and 145% of its capacity, it had, you could still come into Westbard and develop. It would have no impact because they look across the entire cluster. And those decisions, the subdivision staging policy decisions, are based on projections that are 6 years out, which, as I showed earlier, can be very unreliable. Why can't development follow infrastructure instead of the other way around? The county waits until schools are very overcrowded, 120% utilization, before it requires a building moratorium. So one idea is to consider lowering that moratorium level. That doesn't necessarily mean that the funding will be available to add capacity, but it does mean that development would be put on hold and force the hands of MCPS to plan better in terms of capacity. And the capital improvements program budget must work hard. We have to work hard to ensure the funding for capital improvements is available, in particular for Pyle and Whitman, and insist that moratoria apply until there's actually a solution with expenditures programmed in that capital improvements program for planning or construction funds. And part of that gets at, I mentioned earlier, there were 4 high schools that are currently projected to be over 120%, and they will go into moratoria if there's nothing in the CIP that shows an increase in capacity. Oftentimes what is done is when MCPS, when the county council can be assured that MCPS will do its planning and will construct additional capacity within the appropriate time frame, the county council, when it adopts the CIP, will oftentimes add in placeholder projects that have not been planned for at all. And those placeholder projects just ensure that there's additional capacity shown in the CIP, which allows those clusters to avoid the moratorium. What I personally will say is that if there are areas in the county where we want to see growth, then why shouldn't the schools be part of that decision-making process and proactively plan for schools rather than having to put in these placeholder projects in the CIP? If we know we want growth there, why shouldn't we already have a plan for schools? So that's it. I had intended, I forgot to do this, but I had intended on putting up the contact information for you know, the members of the Board of Ed and the County Council, and you know, the hope is that something in here triggered a thought or a desire for you to reach out and contact someone on the County Council, someone, Roger Berliner, our council member, or the Board of Ed or the Planning Board to advocate and to push a lot of these key takeaways. And so, like I said, I'll make those key takeaways available. I'll take one last look to see if there were any additional questions here. Okay, where is the forum on Saturday? The forum is, I'll just pull up that slide again. The forum is on Saturday from 8:30 to 4 at BCC High School. And the morning is dedicated to identifying the issues with current practices and policies, and then the afternoon is dedicated to discussing new potential solutions. And there'll be some presentations, but then a good portion of both the morning and the afternoon will be roundtable discussions. So the idea is if you go to this and you go prepped with a lot of the information that's in here, try to push a lot of these in the conversations you might have at those tables. And I would encourage you to go and not necessarily sit with all the people you know, so that we don't have all of the Westbard people interested in Westbard sitting at one table, but instead spread throughout so that we can ensure that everyone is hearing our talking points. Okay, a few more questions here. I'm going to have to change the way this is viewed so I can see this better. Sorry. Yes. No. Yeah. There was a point that we're potentially looking at this in a vacuum. That there are thousands of units under development in downtown Bethesda, and they'll have an impact on BCC's capacity. And that's absolutely right. And quite honestly, shortly after the charrettes in November, I had someone approach me about a new townhouse development that was proposed for just north of Goldsboro. It's actually in the Bannockburn neighborhood. It's 19 new townhomes, and but that area actually is served by Woodacres. And someone wanted, just pointed that out to me, and my thought was, oh, I can't be concerned about 19 townhomes. I've got, 2,000 potential new units in Westbard. And then it occurred to me that that's exactly how the BCC cluster feels about Westbard. When they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of new new units coming in all the construction that's occurring in downtown Bethesda, you know, what's happening in Westbard doesn't really hit their radar screen. And quite honestly, when you look at what's currently planned, their capacity goes down. The zoning that would occur with the new plan would actually lower the number of residential units that would be in the BCC portion of Westbard. And so, yeah, honestly, the idea of redistricting Westbard is a far-fetched one. There's no, it's like I said, it's the one thing that no one wants to do. That's the last thing they'll look at, and it's not likely to happen in this case. And like I said, at the elementary school level, there are solutions, really, and Whitman can grow, but Pyle is our bigger. Is where our bigger issue is how do we get the capacity at Pyle. How can MCPS estimate that school enrollment will be leveling off in the Whitman cluster when the county's population as a whole is growing? I bet even our area has grown in the last 10 years. Yep, that's a question that many of us have. When we see the projections that they have, it's just not consistent with what we know and what we feel and what we see happening in our neighborhoods. And the truth of the matter is, when you look at the existing trends or patterns in Westbard, people choose to live in those high-rise apartments with multiple children when because they get their kids in the Whitman cluster. People move to the Whitman cluster, and that's why those generation rates are so much higher than what you see across the rest of the county or even across the southwest portion of the county. There's a question about what Chris Nardi, the Pyle principal, says about existing enrollment and projection numbers. I'm not going to speak for Chris, but I know that folks at Pyle don't feel those numbers are accurate. And the point is, if they started using more localized data, and they can do this now, they couldn't a few years back, but now they know exactly where every student lives. They know how many students come from different types of development in different neighborhoods. They can actually run these projections in a more localized fashion. Okay, so there was a question about additional potential solutions in the cluster. Obviously, yeah, there have been a number. At this point, there's some of these are escaping me, but there have been some other ideas discussed. And so, if anyone is listening who's been part of the conversation that you have, feel free to throw them into the Q&A, and I'll mention those. But my mind is kind of a blur at this point. So I will say, if you do have questions, feel free to email me. You can contact me at president@woodacrespta.org, and I'd be happy to either forward your questions on to people who could answer them, or try to answer them myself. But hopefully you found this useful and were able to gather some information that you will be able to carry forward. Just looking at the poll again, we've had upwards of, I've noticed, 53 people participating in this website chat instead of fireside chat. And 7 out of 10 of you, this was the first time that you've participated in a conversation on Westbard. So hopefully this will get more of you engaged. And I will make sure when I post this presentation that I include the contact information for our elected leaders. So at this point, I'm gonna keep this on. I'm gonna mute my microphone. We'll conclude at this point, but if you did, I'll keep it open so that you can submit any additional questions that you might have. Thank you all for participating. Have a good night.